A man stands alone in a valley, Zweihander resting against one armored shoulder as his closed helmet scans the mountainous rim of the valley. Thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of enemy warriors stared back, blades sharp and innumerable, as they began to charge toward the lone man. But the man did not despair, though fear filled him. He took a stance, the broad, gleaming blade of his sword brought into a guard as his enemy bore down on him. He was inured from the ceaseless fighting. Only short rests and episodes of repose were his only grace, as he wound up his sword and brought it cleaving through 7 of the shrieking, laughing enemy warriors. A pair of legs swings out from beneath heavy covers, the sound of a beeping alarm being silenced by a pale hand. The man roared as a blade found a gap in his worn armor, a brutal elbow breaking the arm of his attacker as he whipped around, pinwheeling the massive sword over his head to gain space. But the enemy was tireless, pushing into the sweeping blade even as it tore them apart. The man fought harder than before, bringing the blade around in wide, sweeping arcs to cleave his relentless enemies in twain. The numberless, faceless brutes and beasts, not allowing him a moment of rest. But even as his arms burned, and his broken, aching body protested, he kept swinging. Sword ringing as he cut down swords of his enemies with each strike, desperate not to let them win, desperate not to lose. A thin, pale man rises from his bed, laboriously shaking out his sheets and blankets, before fluffing them out across his mattress and tucking them under the soft pad. Each action seems to take the bland-faced man great effort, eyes downcast and hollow, even as he completes the simple task. Arrows blotted the sun from the sky, and the warrior gazed up as the arrows fell upon him, finding gaps and cracks in his battered armor, the barbed heads digging deep into his flesh. But even as his body bristled with arrows, blood dripping from the seams in his armor, he let loose a roar, sword cleaving yet more enemies in two. Their blood was like sand and ash, sticking to his wounds and blooded flesh like a caustic salve, but it stopped the bleeding, and the pain drove him forward. Like a mad beast he charged through his enemies, breaking them upon his armor and splitting their weak bodies like kindling with his blade. He'd fought this battle time and time again. Though he was exhausted and weakened, he would not give up. He could not give up, for someone still relies on him, and he wouldn't let them down no matter what. So he roared, screamed and cleaved, afraid that one strike might finally lay him low, but continuing on courageously despite it. He wouldn't run away. So long as his legs still moved, he'd sprint headlong at the enemy. The thin man sighed deeply, staring into a pan of sizzling eggs as he quietly flipped them with the spatula in his hand. Grease popped and burned his hand, drawing a rueful gaze as the grease was wiped away on rough denim. The man picked up a ceramic mug with a donkey and the word "bad" on it, drinking heavily from the light brown, opaque liquid inside. Plating the eggs, the man sat at the small table in his equally small dining room, dashing hot sauce and pepper on his breakfast before shoveling it down, not caring that it all tasted like cardboard. The armored man felt an arrow find a gap in his leg armor, the barbed tip sinking deep into his knees and dragging him down. But even as he knelt, wounded and beaten, he continued swinging his mighty sword, the blade cleaving and cutting his assailants, even as they swarmed him. Their cold bodies and harsh words pressing down on the man, venomous speech sharper and more powerful than any blade. He could give up here, and no one would blame him. They'd mourn him, bury him, and move on. But he couldn't allow that. He couldn't allow them to break him. Though it hurt, he forced himself back to his feet, the pain his only friend, as he swung his sword with reckless abandon. They would not break him. They would not break him. They would not break him. The thin man set his plate in the sink, amongst many other dirty and neglected dishes. His eyes wandered over them for a moment, a soft spark, and he rolled up his sleeves. Reaching beneath the fetid, soaking water, he pulled the plug to let it drain, before entirely beginning to scrub the dishes. Steaming water poured forth from the wobbly faucet, as he slowly scrubbed the dishes despite wanting to do anything but. The armored man fought like a holy beast, sword glistening in the endless twilight of his battlefield as it swung back and forth. He lost an eye somewhere, but now he could see better than ever. His sword broke the enemy's blades as they tried to put a stop to his endless rampage. The armored man took no chances as the dead began to pile higher and higher around the battlefield. He no longer thought, nor did he care to think. It was him, his blade, and his enemy, and none would stand between them. When he thought he could fight no more, when he thought his leaden arms would fall away with each swing, he wondered if this was the end of his fight, if this was here he'd die. The thin man looked blankly at an old kitchen knife in his hand, still wet and soapy from where he'd washed it. Something soft butted against his ankle, and he looked down, a soft smile coming to his face as he rinsed the knife off and set it in the drying rack. Toweling his hands dry and turning off the water, he gently picked up the small tabby cat that meowed plaintively before nuzzling into his chin with a soft purr. The armored man looked up as another roar cut through the air, a massive saber-toothed beast ripping its way through his numberless foes to join his side. Broken bodies flew, missing limbs as sand and ash poured from them. The beast joined his side, allowing him a brief moment of respite as his endless foes backed away for a brief moment before charging forward with reckless abandon. The armored man felt a soft grin on his face as he and the saber-toothed beast rushed to meet them, fighting the endless foe hand in hand as the numberless enemy grew countable. The battle was almost over. They just needed to push themselves a little further, and they could rest a moment. The thin man sat on his small sofa, gently petting the soft, warm ball of fur curled up on his chest. The cat vibrated with the intensity at which it purred, its warmth a comforting anchor in a sea of cold. The thin man's phone rang, and he pulled it from his pocket, answering with a soft, "Hello?" His mother's voice burst through the speaker like a fresh burst of spring rain. She asked him how he'd been, and he wanted to lie, to say it was all just perfect. But he couldn't. His voice cracked slightly as the dam finally broke. I'm struggling, Mum. Thanks for calling. I could really use someone to talk to." "Well, seems like I called it a good time. What's on your mind, sweetheart?" The armored man fought harder than he ever had before. Even as his sword broke and his armor shattered away, he fought with a newfound fury. His fists were like divine judgment, sending his enemies flying, broken and beaten. Tirelessly he fought, his enemies falling with only a shout as he wrapped his hands around the throat of the last one, tearing them apart with his bare hands. And as the dust settled, the battle had finally been won, like all others before it. He was the only one left standing. A soft, warm rain began to fall, washing away the caustic ash and sand, mending his wounds and bringing with it a deep sense of relief, as the man slowly sat back in the thick grass of the valley, looking up into the cloudy sky as he let out a soft laugh. He scrubbed the head of the saber-toothed beast fondly, even as he saw more enemies gathering around the valley's rim. He sighed and laughed softly, putting on his worn armor and picking up his Zweihander with a flourish. They would not break him. He would not allow it. And this time, he would not be alone, as another warrior stepped up beside him, leaning casually on their halberd. The thin man pulled on his jacket, softly slipping his phone into his pocket after a long conversation with his mum. Donning a soft smile, he stepped out of his front door with a soft pat on his cat's head. It was raining, but the warm droplets on his face were like a salve to the soul as he jumped off the front steps. He'd make it through the day, unbroken. Beaten, bruised and battered, maybe, but he would not break. Jumping into his friend's car, he jutted his jaw out and made a nonsensical noise, his friend returning the noise like a greeting, as they mutually laughed at their combined silliness. The strange ritual took some of the world's weight off their shoulders, as they prepared to face the day as brothers in arms.